fancy equipment sometimes. And if you decide that testing's not for you, I think it becomes a little bit of guesswork.
Sure. In terms of like in your microcycle, weekly or even daily screening tests, such as the knee to wall,
Yeah,
groin squeeze,
yeah.
sit and reach tests, what are your thoughts regarding that?
Yeah, I think that's where the monitoring becomes really important. And from my side, I don't have the aspect to be able to implement all those type of tests, but something we do implement a lot is a counter movement jump test. And then if we can look at the different metrics within counter movement jump, it gives us quite a bit of information. So for example, we're doing counter movement jump and a reactive strength index test. It gives me a really good indication on the different aspects of possible fatigue that is there. And I think if you can do those sort of tests on a regular basis, as well as things like wellness questionnaires and any data that you can collect that's easily collectible over as often as possible, that gives you reliable and relevant information, can be really useful. And I think that's where people are coming into aspect on that. Okay, let's not test all that often, but I think there has to be a substitute for it. So if you're not doing some sort of monitoring strategy, so if you're not collecting subjective and objective data of some sort, it 100% becomes guesswork. And if you can't get that sort of stuff right,
Sure.
it's very difficult to see where your athletes are at.
Yeah, for sure. The concept regarding starting with the end in mind, how does that sort of apply to an athlete profiling perspective?
Yeah. I think from a physical training perspective, I think it's important that everyone understands the physiological makeup of their sport. You need to understand, okay, so if we take hockey, for example, everyone knows it's an intermittent high intensity sport. So what do we require as a hockey player to make it at an international level? There's enough published data, there's enough information out there for you to identify, okay, what is the minimum standard that an athlete needs to be able to achieve to be able to cope at that level? So when we start with the end in mind, we create a sport profile. So we create a profile around the physiological makeup and physical makeup that athletes require to be able to cope with the demands of that sport. Then we test around it. Then we design a test battery that is going to give us or identify areas that are specific to those demands. So everyone talks about so-called sport-specific testing, which I'm not a big fan of. I think there's sports-relevant testing in the sense that are the tests that we choose giving us the outputs giving us the information according to the demands of that sport. So for example, again, we go back to hockey. We know it's intermittent high intensity sport. With that, you need a very good aerobic base, for example. So what test is easiest to implement as often as possible that's going to give us the best information? So you can look at things like a 30-15, you can look at the yo-yo test, you can look at whichever test that you feel is going to best fit that. So obviously we use the yo-yo test. So we look, okay, cool, we get that. What is the minimum standard that athletes need to require or attain to reach or to compete at the international level? But again, it's also context specific, because what we find is sometimes our worst testers are our best players and vice versa. Because the tactics also come into play. So some of our players that are not great at testing still might be really useful and be some of our better players on the pitch, because tactically they are a little bit better than other players, and other players need to make up physically on that. So it has to be context specific, and you need to identify the areas that you want to test. So for example, we stopped at the aerobic system, so we're going to go, what is the anaerobic capacity we want to look at? Things like 6 times 30 meter repeat sprints. Then we look at anaerobic speed reserve. We look at maximal aerobic speed, strength testing, and all those things. You come up with a profile where you can find, okay, where is the leakage in that athlete? And then you try to work on those weaknesses and improve on their strengths, which is probably even more important.
Yeah. Yeah, it's always an interesting sort of dichotomy in terms of the testing and actual tactical performance. How much emphasis do you place on those testing results in terms of, going into selection and all that sort of stuff?
100%.
I think it's always quite an interesting
I think
debate.
I think it's a difficult one. I think if you got Lionel Messi that's playing and he not a great tester, I think I'd select him anyways.
100%.
So.
Yeah. So you've identified what you require to play an international hockey match. You've selected your tests. You've done your tests. What is the next process in terms of using that data now?
Yeah. So I think once you got your athlete profile and that data, I think the most important thing is to look at how you're going to plan your cycles. So not only do you plan your training cycles around where you're at within a training phase for the whole team, but you can also plan it around what that athlete or the athletes require the most work on. So I always start with the notion that when I start in a new environment, that athlete's training age is 0 because they haven't been in my training environment before. So I say, okay, I got athletes of a training age of 0, regardless of how experienced they are, because my implementation might be different to the person that I succeeded or whatever. And then I start from there. And I think, in my opinion, I think you need a big base regardless of who you're working with and regardless of what the testing results are. You need to start with the fundamentals, and you can get a big base of fundamentals. You put yourself in a better position when you move into the season to work on the more so-called sports specific or sports relevant strength and conditioning stuff, the things that are really going to transfer onto the pitch. But if you don't have that big base, it becomes really difficult. And that's where the testing data becomes really useful, because when you get into that sports-specific prep phase, you get into the advanced physical development phases, that's where the testing is going to tell us, okay, cool, athlete X has a really bad reactive strength index. How can we implement different strategies to improve their neuromuscular function? And that becomes later in the phases. So those are quite important.
Yeah, interesting. And your reporting systems, how do you make sure that that data is meaningful for yourself, but also for the players, for the coaches?